Thanks, y'all. I like to have the support of the dogs. It's always exciting. Appreciate it. I'm really happy to be here. Thanks for having me. My name is Jake Conroy. I am from San Francisco, California, in the United States. I really like coming to Luxembourg. It's one of my favorite conferences. It's a great place to meet a lot of new people, network with people, and also share new ideas. For whatever reason, I like to come and stand on this giant stage and do a talk for the first time to all of you, and it's kind of nerve-wracking. So I appreciate you bearing with me on these new ideas. But I'm also a big fan of challenging one another and asking big questions about ourselves and asking big questions about our movement. Not because I love to argue. Well, actually, I do love to argue, but it's not the only reason I do it. And not because I think that we're all doing everything wrong, but because I think that when we challenge each other on how to become stronger and how to become a more successful movement. And I think that is really important. Sorry, there isn't a talk without technical difficulties. So with that, my talk is called A Case for Campaigns, Reflections on Vegan Outreach and Purity Politics. So the only thing I think vegans love more than food is our numbers, right? And we can package our ideologies, our ethics, our campaigns, our strategies into these nicely packed and presentable statistics and numbers. And we can recite them on cue, and we can present them to the public, we can present them to our friends and family, and oftentimes we become shocked when people don't immediately change their lifestyles based upon these numbers that we present to them. And I think oftentimes we dismiss other movements' set of numbers, like often in the environmental movement, for instance. You know, the environmental movement loves to cite numbers about recycling and changing light bulbs and installing solar panels and how that will reduce energy and so forth and so on and save the climate. And as vegans, our first response is often, but veganism, right? So then we tick off like another round of statistics and numbers about animal agriculture and veganism and water use and greenhouse gases. And those things are all true. And we love, as an animal rights movement, I think we love the statistics. But what if we are conveniently picking and choosing our statistics and ignoring the ones that may be pointing to the idea that over the past 35 years as a modern animal rights movement, that we have made very few advances in the world of vegan outreach. That in some really big places that we may actually be failing. So yes, right, all the new vegan restaurants, I love the vegan restaurants. There's 30 different flavors of cashew, cashew nut ice cream on the shelves. There's 10 flavors of Oatly, which is secretly the only reason I come to Europe because I love Oatly. And of course, like the world's cutest packaging for vegan food in Sweden. These were like the greatest things ever. I was very excited. These things are all surely a sign that like we are winning, right? But what if all of this means is that we as vegans just have more options to pick from? That it really has no bearing, basically, on how much veganism or vegans or our desire to change the world one person at a time. Maybe none of this is a bearing that is actually working. So every couple of years, I think we hear about amazing numbers. We hear about amazing statistics and percentages. At the Animal Rights Conference in the United States this past year, which I would argue is probably one of the world's largest animal rights conferences where thousands of people show up, prominent leaders in the animal rights movement proclaimed that we are at a tipping point for veganism, a tipping point for animals, that with a little more hard work, we would see our vegan world actualized. So take, for instance, in Great Britain recently, right? We were told that vegans and vegetarians now make up 3.25% of the population in Great Britain. That's 1.68 million people, right? That's pretty exciting. That's a growth of 350% since 2006. That could be a tipping point. But the thing is with numbers, that there are always more numbers, right? So this highly offensive cover to a Gallup poll that was done in 1990 in the United Kingdom as well. At that time in 1990, they made animal lovers rejoice, right? The 1990 report said that vegetarians and vegans now made up 3.7% of the population in Great Britain. Roughly 2.1 million people were vegetarian and vegan. So wait, like what happened here, right? Like how did the percentages actually go down from 1990 to this report that came out this year? What happened between 1990 and 2006 that made so many people stop being vegan and stop being vegetarian? And sure, we can factor in things like population growth and other variables, but the bottom line is the numbers really haven't changed that much. And yeah, the numbers from the past 10 years, they look great on paper, but what about the reality of the situation? How come the numbers dropped over the past 26 years? What happened to this tipping point? And do tipping points only exist in these bubbles that we've created for ourselves? So one of the biggest responses I think I hear from people about conferences like this is that they never want to leave these conferences, myself included, right? And who can blame us for that? We look around, we're buying vegan candy and vegan books and shirts from inside of an old slaughterhouse where now there are like ALF banners hanging from the ceilings where there used to be cows hanging, right? Like that's amazing, that's remarkable. And we wish we could continue to be surrounded by the people that we're sitting with right now, all the time. And the rest of the world doesn't understand us, right? We don't want to have to explain our diet all the time and explain where we get our protein from and ask if there are eggs in the bread or if there are goose feathers in the pillows in the rooms that we stay in. We don't want to have to do these things, right? And I can relate to that sentiment. It feels good to be in this bubble. But the reality is that the world goes on around us every single day. And unfortunately, if we want to continue to focus on numbers, that's 70 billion animals killed every single year so that people can eat them. That's 6 million animals every single hour that are killed. That's 3.17 million kilograms of manure, of shit, produced every hour in the United States alone. And that's an upward of 76 trillion gallons of water, and I apologize for gallons, used by animal agriculture every year. 76 trillion gallons, right? That's a number that my tiny brain cannot convert to kilograms or metric, so I apologize. But you get the point, right? For decades, people have been handing out vegan flyers in front of restaurants and movies and concerts and universities, myself included. People have produced videos, written essays on how to hand out flyers, how to use body language effectively, how to flick your wrist to draw attention to the flyer that you're handing out. People have made careers and written books and traveled around the world to tell people why and how to pass a piece of paper to another person. And then there are the studies and statistics and numbers on outreach, right? If you one flyer you hand out equals 10 animals saved, or one vegan means 125 animals not eaten every year, or 125 animals saved every year. 5% of the population in Israel is vegan, 360% increase in the United Kingdoms of vegans and vegetarians. But the fact is, in places like the United States, in places like Israel, we aren't really making any headway, right? Despite the numbers and the percentages of vegans in the population, despite the amazing food in the stores, despite the millions of leaflets we hand out, the vegan demonstrations we have, and the countless restaurants we all love to eat at, myself included, the US and Israel continue to eat more kilograms of animals per capita than almost any place in the world, right? This is from 2015, I believe, which is the most recent statistics. But in fact, the numbers between 2013 and 2015 have not even changed in a lot of places, including places like the United States and Israel. Despite all the work and all the statistics and numbers that say that we are at tipping points, the amount of meat that is being consumed per person per capita in these countries has not changed. And recently, there was a study that came out in the United States a few months ago that indicated that, at least in the United States, meat eating is actually on the rise again, and it's expected to skyrocket over the course of the next few years. So what is the answer to this problem, right? How do we reduce that number, 70 billion, to zero? What's our long-term strategies? What are our tactics? What are we doing to solve this disaster? And for a lot of people in the animal rights movement, I think the answer is to have people switch their diet to veganism. And yes, like if the world went vegan, our problems would be solved, right? We would dive into this utopian world. There would be no more animal suffering. Climate change would be fixed. Starvation would end. Cats and dogs living together. It would be a utopia, right? So individuals, myself included, have spent countless hours and hours posting on Facebook, handing out leaflets, showing videos, paying people to watch videos, distributing vegan food on the streets, holding signs in front of restaurants, campaigning has often been replaced by posting as many animal abuse videos as you can, and long-term strategizing has been taken over by singing songs in grocery stores and standing on street corners with frightening white masks. So in the United States, organizations receive and spend literally millions and millions of dollars every year to try to convince people to adopt a vegan lifestyle, to convince the world, one person at a time, to stop eating and wearing animals. And we're told, like, if we convert 5 people to become vegan, and those 5 people convert other, 5 more people to become vegan, and it starts to spread, that in 20 years we'll have this vegan world. And we're told it's just a simple matter of supply and demand, that money is the bottom line for these industries. Therefore, if we can get one person to stop eating animals, we are thrusting this movement forward. But I think if we critically examine this way of thinking, if we ask these big questions, if we have these difficult conversations, I think we're going to come to the realization that individuals eating animals isn't actually the problem. Eating animals is the symptom, right? It's the symptom of a much bigger problem. The bigger problem, of course, is the system that spends billions in advertising to shape culture, to shape desire, to shape class. The system that receives billions of dollars of subsidies from our governments when the amount of people eating animals drops so that these industries can stay open and stay afloat. The system that uses its influence to write laws to go against people like ourselves and breaks other laws to destroy its competition. So instead of the impossible task of taking down the world's biggest and most powerful industries by convincing people one at a time to essentially boycott them into bankruptcy, which personally I think is a strategy that will never ever work. I think we need to engage in actual smart and strategic campaigns to put dents in and holes and eventually take down the industries. So if we think of the animal abuse industries as like a massive invasive tree, right, that we need to get rid of, right, to remove, what's the best way to do that? So the current model that we kind of have been using in the animal rights movement and perpetuating for decades is to start at the top of that tree and start pulling off the leaves one at a time, right? Converting people one at a time. And those leaves might not come off immediately. You might have to be pulling on these leaves for months, sometimes years, one by one. But those leaves eventually are going to come off the tree. And ever so slowly, we'll move our way down this tree, pulling each leaf off until the tree is essentially bare. But the problem is, by the time we get to the bottom of the tree, all the leaves at the top have already started to grow back. And it's growing back at an alarming rate. And worse, it starts spreading, right? Now there are multiple invasive trees all over the place. And our small numbers, unfortunately, we just simply can't keep up with this. And people get sick of pulling these leaves off, of converting people one at a time. People give up. They move on. And the people who start pulling those leaves off again at the top think they're the first ones to do it, and they have come up with new and novel ways that surely no one has thought of over the last 30 or 40 years. But for some reason, we miss the obvious answers. So the smart arborist, right, someone that specializes in trees, would climb to the top of that tree and they start hacking away at the easy branches to cut off, whole branches. We take off whole limbs, working our way down the tree systematically to dismantle it. There isn't a need to pull those leaves off one at a time because they come off with the branches anyways. And eventually we're hacking off all these major limbs, and then finally we get to the bottom where we have to dig up the roots until we get our hands dirty and do this real hard work of digging up and removing the main roots of the problem. Only then will we, I think, make significant change. And this way we are worrying less about the symptom and more about the root problem. So what happens if we stop focusing on the individual and focus more on the root problems? So I'm probably dating myself here, but do anyone remember this flyer? Anyone? Yes. A couple other old activists in the room. Makes me feel a little better about myself and my age. So when I started doing activism in the mid-1990s, there was a case called the McLibel Case going on in England. It was in full swing. It had been going on for 10 years at that point. So the case, if you're not familiar with the McLibel Case, look it up. It's really easy to find. The case is basically like an insane story of people doing vegan outreach and leafleting with this flyer they made against McDonald's. And the story involves like informants and undercover cops, like infiltrating like vegan outreach organization of like 5 people. And it turned into the longest civil litigation in England's history to like against McDonald's versus like these vegan environmentalists. But at the core of all of that, it was just a couple of people handing out vegan literature in the mid-'80s, right, in front of McDonald's. So when I got involved in activism, we were still handing out these same flyers, like 10 years later, like still doing the same thing in front of McDonald's. And we were doing it not because we were doing it because we wanted to show solidarity with the people on trial in England, but also we wanted to educate people about veganism and why they switched their diets. And we handed these flyers out for years and years in front of McDonald's. And at the 100 of outreach tables my friends and I would do at hardcore shows and punk shows and various events around the Seattle area, handing them out on the streets. Like wherever we could, we'd set up tables and hand out literature. And I remember one time we were handing out vegan literature in front of a McDonald's, and I offered it to this guy, and he said to me, "Oh, I'm already vegetarian." And I naturally replied, "Oh, then maybe you should consider switching to veganism." And I always remember, like as he passed, he turned and he looked me in the eye and he said, "You know what? Nothing is ever fucking good enough for you people." And I'm sure at the time, like, I snapped back with some, like, obnoxious comment about, like, yeah, you're right, like, go vegan, or, like, it's not very, comfortable for the animals, and that's not good enough, so forth and so on. All legitimate arguments, right? But I still think about that guy, and that was, like, his response to us asking him to go vegan. And I think about how that basically summed up a decade of my experience of doing vegan outreach consistently, that nothing at the end was really ever good enough for us. So we as an animal rights movement, we've set this like moral baseline for acceptance into like our club, into our movement. And if you don't meet this bar, you're essentially not welcome, right? And I'm not saying everyone is like that, but I would argue that like anyone can turn on their computer or their phone right now and look on Facebook and see someone yelling at someone that isn't quite vegan. And that often includes ridiculing people. It means talking down to people. It's implying that you aren't good enough and that you need to do more. The idea of purity politics is the philosophy that a movement and its successes is based on others being pure. And I'm sure that when we think of that, a lot of us think of fascists and nationalists. And I'm not suggesting that veganism has anything to do with fascists or nationalists. But in the animal rights movement, success is measured by everyone and everything being 100% vegan, right? That's the goal, this purity, this 100% purity, which of course is literally an impossible goal, right? Because of this, from the beginning, because we've set this baseline, we've set ourselves up for failure. Because in some form or another, our vegan food, our vegan clothes, our vegan lifestyles, all of this are built on the back of animals, right? Both human and non-human animals. The vegetables we eat, the cute packaging that we buy, the ice cream I love to consume as much as humanly possible, like all that comes from somewhere. There are animals involved in making these things, despite that they're vegan, right? So we've decided that our near impossible goal is convincing the world's population of 7 billion people that they need to adopt a vegan lifestyle, as this is the answer to the world's problems. As I said, from animal suffering to climate change, from starvation, that veganism is the answer. And that might seem like an easy ask in the bubbles that we live in our circle of friends, with our families, maybe at our workplaces. These are people we should be able to influence with our ideologies. But we end up bombarding people with the same message that guy told me, right? Nothing is ever good enough. If you eat local backyard honey as a brand new vegan, you're now suddenly a bee torturer. If you eat palm oil, you're not vegan. If you aren't kind to animals, we will kill you, right? Like, what kind of, I mean, I realize it's kind of a joke, but still, like, you see people handing out vegan literature with this shirt on. And think about that. Like, think about when you first went vegan, right? It felt great to be vegan. It still feels great to be vegan, right? You feel like you're making a difference with your actions. You feel like you could change the world. You feel like, that anything is possible. But how many of us would still be vegan today that if in your first month of veganism you had 30 people attacking you because you didn't realize that an ingredient wasn't okay to eat? And how many of you would even consider veganism if someone wearing this shirt handed you a flyer telling you to change and be kind to animals, right? Like, what would your reaction be to that, right? So we are constantly attacking people because they aren't at our level of purity, that they can't participate because they haven't reached perfection yet. You can't be a meat-eating environmentalist. You can't care about animals and eat them too. And I would argue, however, that you actually can be a meat-eating environmentalist. You actually can care about animals and eat them as well. It's weird, but it's possible, right? So in a not so perfect world, amazing people do amazing things all the time, and they're not vegan. Their diet doesn't cancel out the amazing activism they do, the lives they lead, the people that they are, the decisions that they make. It doesn't mean that people can't improve or that they can't change, but it means we should recognize people for the complex animals that we all are. So to illustrate the point, because we're all sitting here all day, let's play a little game, right? So I'm going to put up 4 people, and you have to tell me which ones are vegan. Let's see if this works. So Martin Luther King Jr., right? Considered one of the greatest activists of all time. He preached nonviolent civil disobedience. He was extremely influential in shaping the civil rights movement. People all across the world rejoice and love Martin Luther King. A young Paul Watson, right there in the middle, right? The founder of Sea Shepherd. Despite how you feel about him today, he was the first person really to launch a radical ocean-going direct action organization. One of his first actions was to purchase a ship, find the Sierra, one of the most notorious whaling ships in the history of the modern day world, find the ship, ram it, and eventually sink it to the bottom of the ocean. The rogue ship was sunk, and that ship was also known for killing upwards of 25,000 whales, now at the bottom of the ocean. Early members of the Animal Liberation Front, right? One of my personal favorite groups in the animal rights movement. They have liberated hundreds of thousands, if not over 1 million of animals, done more than hundreds of millions of dollars worth of economic damage to the animal abuse industries since the early 1970s. And finally, we have Steve Wynn, right? Billionaire creator and owner of multiple casinos in Las Vegas throughout the United States. Which are famous not just for the vegan food and the buffets, vegan buffets that are supposed to be pretty amazing, that he put in every one of his high-end resorts, but also famous for keeping captive dolphins and tigers, kept in cramped enclosures and tanks and used for entertainment purposes. So maybe the answer is obvious to some of you, I don't know, but only one of these people in these scenarios are vegan. Martin Luther King Jr., despite having an animal-friendly quote attributed to him, which historians say aren't true, he was never vegan. A young Paul Watson out sinking whaling and sealing ships in the name of environment and conservation. At the time that he sunk the Sierra, also not vegan. Early members of the Animal Liberation Front, right? And some members of the Liberation Leagues in England were not always vegan in the beginning, or even vegetarian in certain circumstances, right? League organizers, Animal Liberation League organizers, vegan, the people participating, their requirements were that they would be against vivisection. So that leaves us with Steve Wynn, the only vegan up there. Interesting, right? So a billionaire casino mogul that many rejoice as a hero for making vegan food options available at all his resorts, despite his captive dolphins, captive white tigers, and others that he uses for entertainment. By purity standards that we put on ourselves and in our movement, we often put other vegans, we basically should be shunning Martin Luther King Jr. We should be shunning a young Paul Watson, the early Animal Liberation Front, and we should be embracing a guy who keeps animals for profit. This doesn't make any sense to me, right? And I hope it doesn't make any sense to you as well. And I think it needs to change. And I'm not suggesting we don't talk about veganism. I'm not suggesting we don't be proud of being vegan. But perhaps as individuals, as grassroots organizations and groups that live and work outside of that bigger NGO world, perhaps we need to be putting less of a focus on veganism being the success marker for our liberation struggles and rather allow it to be the result of our campaigns. Because if we do away with the idea of purity, we open the doors that would have normally been closed. When we start to do away with this need for perfection in diet, we can start to see opportunities for unlikely allies and collaboration, opportunity to strengthen our communities, to learn from the mistakes and successes of others and their movements, and use collective power to achieve our goals. But that takes patience, it takes compassion, it takes meeting people where they're at. It means putting less attention on the diets of individuals. It means accepting that there are different roads towards liberation and that we are different places on that road. And by doing away with purity politics, I think we will then be able to see the importance of collective liberation. The idea of collective liberation being that the fight for animals is just as important as the fight for the environment. It's just as important as the fight for human liberation. that these movements are that these movements are ones that we can, and they're movements that we should participate in, not because we want something in return from them, that we want them to come to our animal rights demonstrations or our gatherings, or we want them to go vegan, but because they are movements worthy of our support. That doesn't mean we abandon our own fight for non-human animals, but I think the more we show solidarity with other movements, the more these doors are going to start opening. And as I said, we start opening them by showing solidarity, and with that, the more successful we will be. So I also think these movements will start to take us more seriously when we focus less on the purity of veganism and put more energy into strategic and targeted short-term and long-term campaigns against the systems of oppression that keep all of us down, including non-human animals. So as individuals, leading by example with a vegan lifestyle, I think is a great thing to do. But as activists, as organizations, as movements, I think we need to honestly reevaluate a lot of the strategies that we've been working on. And I said before, when I first got involved, I jumped right into the vegan outreach and the flyers and the tables. And part of the reason that we did them was because people did them before us, right? Before I came around, the group I worked with, they did a lot of vegan outreach. And it didn't really seem that I should question it that much, that I should just do it. It just seemed like that's what was happening, that's what had been happening, and that would continue to happen. And we thought that if we could change enough people one by one, we would achieve the utopian society that I mentioned. But looking back, I start questioning if we were actually very successful and what we possibly could have done differently. And as I said, I think the answer lies in part by switching gears from the vegan outreach and individual lifestyle changes towards more systemic, long-term campaigning. So we should start asking questions, right? Why do we have millions of vegans across the world and so few activists? Why can we get 10,000 people to show up and wait in line for an hour at a vegan burger, at like a vegan food festival, but we can't get 10 people of those vegans to show up and stand in line for an hour for a demonstration? We need to ask why when people become vegan, the statistics are showing that on average, they only stay vegan for 7 years. Why have we spent millions and millions of dollars on vegan outreach in the United States alone, and vegans maintain and often slip below the 2% population mark? I think it's because we insist on making people vegans first and activists second. But I think if we as activists switch that around and create interesting, smart, successful campaigns that will capture the imagination of the general public, that everyone will start to join us. Vegans, vegetarians, omnivores, everybody. And we have seen it time and time again on a variety of different levels in many different movements, right? The environmental movement gets massive reform done in the corporate sector by channeling not just environmental activists, but the general public to their causes. Conservation organizers have used the same tactics to shut down entire fishing industries. The Black Lives Matter movement in the United States, starting with just a hashtag on Twitter, and several years later have ended up in face-to-face meetings in the White House, right? So in the animal rights movement, the more radical campaigns like SHAC or Green Hill or the campaign against the Royal Institute in Brazil, they leveraged pressure from animal rights activists and the general public to get the big successes that they got. In the 1980s, the Animal Liberation Front partnered with PETA, right? And worked side by side to expose horrors of the vivisection industry and to the general public. And because of that work, they ended experiments and closed labs, again, by partnering and channeling the power of the local communities and not just vegans and animal rights activists. But this philosophy doesn't have to just apply to these radical campaigns. We see it play out in really interesting and successful ways around the world. So like the Humane League in the United States, who recently convinced the largest representative of egg producers to end the practice of shredding newborn male chicks alive, right? That's gonna save potentially hundreds of million male baby chicks a year. And I don't think this happens because the egg industry felt overrun by the millions and millions of vegans in the United States. I think it happened because, in my opinion, because a handful of activists put together a solid plan and a strategy and they put it into action and they worked really hard and they got some really amazing results. Ultimately, I think if we make vegans, we are not necessarily making campaigners. But if we end up make campaigners, I think we eventually end up making vegans. So these numbers, these statistics, these ideas that I've been saying are not meant to anger you. They're not meant to depress you. But I'm hoping these numbers will get us all to stop for a minute and stop pursuing the same strategies and the same tactics that we have literally been doing for decades and decades. And for whatever reason, we decide every year, again, to continue doing these things over and over again. Because maybe we think we can do it better than everyone that's come before us, I'm not too sure. But the numbers that we so deeply cling to regarding veganism indicate that so far that we had not reached a level of success that I think we often think that we have. So in the beginning, I said I think we need to ask ourselves big, important questions and have difficult conversations, and I would just reiterate that again. We need to feel okay about having these conversations. We need to feel okay to have and ask big questions. We need to feel okay about saying things that might not be very, very popular, and we need to make others feel more comfortable in speaking up with their opinions that also might not be very popular, right? We need to allow room for people to be vulnerable, to make mistakes, to ask questions, and be willing to ask questions of ourselves and be honest about maybe we weren't doing things right all along, or maybe we were, who knows, right? But we need to stop focusing so much on the purity of veganism and it as a moral baseline. And I think how we can be the most strategic, and I think we need to think about how we can be the most strategic for non-human animals. And the answers might not be what you want to hear, right? It might not get you the most pats on the back. It might not get you the most likes on Facebook, but I think they need to be said. And it's time to do things differently within our grassroots organizations, within our movements. It's time to sit down and do long-term strategizing with realistic, tangible goals as the outcome. We need to check in on those plans every once in a while to make sure that we're on the same paths towards our goals. It's time to form groups and communities and movements with like-minded friends, as well as unlikely allies, people you might not have thought of allies in the past, and that we can start moving, and all that can start moving us forward, start putting legitimate holes in the animal abuse industries and capitalism. But most importantly, I think it's time for all of you to make decisions, right? And I said at the beginning of the talk, I love this conference. I think it's great. I love coming here every year. I look forward to it. There's great people in attendance. There's some great speakers. There's some really great ideas, but at the end of the day, that's all this is, right? It's just ideas. And I've rambled on for a better part of an hour, just like all the speakers before me and all the speakers that are gonna come after me. And I get to hold this microphone and I get to stand in front of the big screen with like the fancy pictures and the moving slides and like project my thoughts to you. And I get to stand on this impressive stage where like I should be here with like a guitar and like fireworks shooting and all that sort of thing. And all of you, sit down there and like you look up at us and the speakers. But at the end of the day, they're just my ideas, right? I could be right. I could be totally wrong. I can present them as fact and the only way forward, even though they might be complete and total failures. But ultimately, you have to make some decisions. You have to decide how you want to shape your life. You have to decide how you want to shape your campaigns, your organization, your movement. Because this movement ultimately belongs to all of you. It's not dictated to you by people who get to stand on the stages at the conferences all over the world. It's not dictated to you by people who have the fancy titles and the fancy jobs and the big salaries. It's not dictated to you by people who have a louder voice simply because they've been involved in the movement for a long time. It's your movement. It's your movement to shape. It's your movement to mold however you see fit. And you are in a unique position. All of us are in a unique position. A position where you can start to write the next chapter in our movement's history. And more importantly, the next chapter in the lives of countless animals. It's an enormous responsibility, but it's also extremely exciting. And that energy that we feel when we're here, right? When we buy the candy, when we buy the shirts, we're in the old slaughterhouses, we're here feeling energized. That feeling, the energy, that feeling that we're unstoppable, that we are winning. You can decide how you take that energy away from here and bring it home, right? It doesn't have to just exist in our bubbles. And we can use that energy. We can use it to reshape our strategies. We can use it to reshape our goals. We can use it to reshape our lives. And most importantly, we need to decide how we can start to use this energy to really start winning. Thank you. So my goal of like talking to the 50-minute mark, so I wouldn't have to answer any questions, failed. So I do. There is like some time to answer questions. I'm happy to answer questions here, or I'll be around all weekend and we can have one-on-one conversations. Or if you have ideas and tactics and things you're organizing that you want to share with one another, like and have discussions back and forth, that seems much more interesting and fruitful for me than just me standing on stage like talking at you. So. I can't see anyone except for that waving hand, so we can start there.
Thank you. Is it not significant that the examples you gave of the animal activists who Watson and the ALF are from 40 years ago, and that now it would be pretty unthinkable that either one would not be vegan? And also, you say we need to make campaigners. How do we make campaigners? And thank you.
You're welcome. So, I'm sorry, the first question was, is it unthinkable that 40 years ago, is it not significant? Yeah, yeah, for sure. Yes, I think it is significant. But I think because I waited till the last minute to put my talk together, those were the easy examples for me. But I mean, we can find people like that all the time, right? Like there are prominent people in the animal rights movement now that I think do amazing work. But if you ask, they're not actually vegan. I could have made a list of like 10, 20 people up here that aren't vegan, that are doing amazing work for animals, and I don't think they should be discounted. Some of those people, yeah, I think the idea is that like, yes, there are amazing people, they're doing amazing work in a lot of different movements, and I think maybe it's because I spend a lot of time on social media, unfortunately, that I see a lot of this like bickering and a lot of like, this person isn't vegan, this person isn't 100% this, and therefore they don't count until they reach this level. And I see that all the time. It happened. I mean, it seemed to be. I wasn't around then, but it seemed like a little less lenient back then, or a little more lenient, excuse me, of accepting and allowing more people into our movements. The second part of the question was, how do we make campaigners? I don't know. I think in my personal experiences, doing the SHAC campaign, for people who don't know, a worldwide movement to shut down an animal testing laboratory called Huntington Life Sciences. I'm doing a talk on Sunday if you're interested in more about that. But campaigns like that didn't have like a moral baseline of like, you need to be vegan before you can protest. You need to be vegan before you can care about the animals inside of Huntington Life Sciences. It was anyone and everyone who has the idea and the desire to shut this place down can show up and be a part of this and make change. And obviously, I think there are some guidelines to that. Obviously, we weren't interested in working with racists or fascists or nationalists or anything like that. But people that kind of shared the general idea of collective liberation, or thought that they were on the road to that path, was they could participate, right? So if we have these campaigns and we open them up to people that aren't necessarily in our immediate circles, I think people will start getting on board. And we saw that in the SHAC campaign, and I saw that in other campaigns that I've worked on throughout the 20 years or whatever of doing activism. People that are on the fence, that are interested in what we're doing, and if you welcome them in, I think you can get people to protest, you can get people to start organizing, and then through that process, I think people start realizing what the issues really are. For instance, organizing a campaign against whaling, right? And we started working with local fishermen and local loggers in the area who were against the hunting of whales. Obviously, they weren't vegetarian, they weren't vegan, but we organized with them. And over the course of like a couple of years of working with them, and then them saying like, oh, I love these whales so much, I don't understand why people want to hunt them. You start opening up these conversations to, well, actually, like, the gray whale is just a bottom feeder, just roams around and eats garbage off of the ground. It's really not that much different from a cow or a pig. And they're like, oh, I guess I never really thought of it that way. And you can start introducing into the concepts of vegetarianism, of veganism, of animal liberation. And I think those doors are much easier to open and for people to walk through to get on board.
So thank you first. And I think I'm a little bit afraid that a purist is the new radical. You know what I mean? Like people.
I'm sorry. What's the new radical?
Purist, like okay. Purism. people from outside the movement call us radicals, and people from inside now is calling this purism new thing. And I think like it's important to us to realize that sometimes we need to have different approach to different people, but nothing like we can do some alliances with some people to specific campaigns. For example, this animal testing, or like the PAC group that you put a picture there, this party in Spain against Toro de la Vega. I think it's something specific, but I think also that we cannot stop talking people about veganism. I think there's not purism. You know, I think considering this purism is the same thing that people call us radicals just because we are seeing the whole problem. Because being vegetarian is really not enough when you think about animal suffering. And I think when you call that guy vegan, for my standards, it's not vegan when you explore animals. This is the baseline for being vegan. So someone cannot be called vegan if they're exploring tigers to entertainment. This is like basic moral line. And I think we could make some alliance to some specific things, but this doesn't mean that we are purists when you're claiming people to be vegan. You know, like I just think we should separate it, because I'm really afraid that most of our campaigns, like it's increasing this thought of like Meatless Monday stuff, that we need to be, you know, understanding people like with their time and stuff. But I think we're getting also, there's the risk of getting too soft, and it's all fine that people are making everything what they want and calling themselves vegans when they're eating, you know. But this is my point of view about vegan. I'm like, I can explore, like, you know, my pets, reproduce them and sell the puppies, for example. You know, this is not vegan for me. And I think it is complicated, and I keep calling vegan like purism campaign.
Cool. Yeah, I don't necessarily disagree with you. I think for me at this point, like and this is just my opinion and the way I am, but like I don't really care like what people call themselves at this point. Like I don't care if people call this guy vegan or not. Like clearly he's not a great guy. But I think it goes back to the idea of like focusing on an individual. Who got to decide what vegan is, right? Like these shoes, right? They're vegan. They're made of canvas, but I'm not sure where they were manufactured. When I eat sugar, yeah, sugar technically is vegan if it wasn't processed through bone char, but that sugar was raised in a cane field halfway around the world. It was probably manufactured or harvested by children or people in forced labor. Millions of insects were killed to make that sugar. It was chopped down, put in boxes, put onto a cargo ship that polluted the environment to ship it halfway around the world, killing, again, millions of animals probably in the process of shipping it. It shows up in like my my cookie that I buy at a grocery store that also probably is selling animals, and I eat it down because it's delicious. But like, and it's vegan, but like, is it really vegan? Like at what point do we stop? Do we like at what point did we decide like what is vegan and what is not? And if that line is a little bit wavy, which I think it is, like, does it really matter where people fall on that line, right? Does it matter if like people who are saying, you know, oh, I'm vegan, but maybe they eat honey from their friend's backyard? Does that individual, in the grand scheme of things, end up really making a difference in changing the lives of 70 billion animals that are killed every year? Like, we spend so much time arguing and debating about one specific person and this specific person, and this person wears fur, and therefore we need to protest against that individual. This person who's a famous pop star was vegan for 30 days and now she's not, and now we should protest all of her concerts. Like, I don't understand why like we are focusing so much on individuals, because the statistics in my mind are showing that like focusing on individuals, we're not achieving anything. We're not getting anywhere. And I think that we need to broaden our scopes and broaden our visions. And I've seen it in other movements, and the movements are most successful when they start opening doors to people that aren't immediately on board with their exact values, but they share the same ideas of collective liberation, right? So I can go to like anti-war movement people or Black Lives Matter people or people that were like in the Black Panther Party and say, hey, like, will you help us on these projects? It's not necessarily, you know, they're not necessarily vegan, but they understand, for instance, like the idea of anti-capitalism and understand how animal agriculture plays into capitalism. And they want to defeat animal agriculture because it destroys their environment, it destroys their families, but they're not so concerned about animals as much. Maybe they will be in the future. Do I disregard those individuals because they want the same thing, but they don't want it for the same reasons? So I don't know, like these are tough questions, right? Like I'm not saying you're wrong and I'm not saying that I'm wrong, but I think these are important to like have these discussions and back and forth. Because I see people out here are disagreeing with me and that's awesome. Like we should be disagreeing, we should be having these conversations, we should be arguing, right? Politely, respectfully, and preferably without one person with a microphone on a big stage. But yeah, these are questions we should be having because I don't think they're easy answers. Does anyone have any thoughts about that they want to chime into the conversation or add? There's someone in the back. Yeah.
Oh, we have one question here.
Is it a follow-up to this?
She was already. It's okay.
We got time. We got like 5-10 minutes.
Not really, but
we're here all day.
Like two
minutes.
So does anyone have like a follow-up question to that one? Is it a follow-up?
Well, if we had a random, like a next question, we can just go in order.
Okay.
I was just wondering if people wanted to add to that conversation.
Yeah, not really. And I was asked to ask a short question. I don't know how to do that really. I'll try. And many things you said ring very true to me. And as I said yesterday, I spent 30 years in the feminist movement, and in particular lobbying the European Union. And I found that the real successes we had were when we went in alliance with other movements. And it was incredible to see the gender blindness of the environmental movement and the gender blindness of the trade union movement. But every time we had these interactions and actually did common lobbying campaigns, we were very, very successful, not only in terms of the success, but bringing gender into the environmental movement. And then the environmental movement being completely animal blind for a certain period of time. And I remember meeting environmentalists who just would look at me and say, well, eating animal is normal, and not understanding the links. So to come to my question, it's how do we establish those links that I mean, being a vegan now for me is difficult. It's difficult to be here because I don't understand how I link myself as an individual, having worked in movements, how I link this veganism with the feminism and the environmentalism and all that. So, and I feel we need to understand what we share. It's the system, it's the capitalism, it's the exploitation that is at the base why I became vegan. That I'm against those types of systems, and I want to challenge those systems, and just being a vegan is not enough for me. But how do I do the reach out, and how do we, within the movement, relate to organizations like Gaia and Peter, etc., and how do we make those links and bring them into the movement to do exactly what you're saying, because we want to change the way the system works and stop exploitation. If you have some thoughts around those issues.
Yeah, I mean, it's just real quickly, but I mean, it sounds like I think you're a great example of like with feminism and introducing it to all these other movements and how successful that was, right? Like clearly, like we need to be talking to people from other movements that have histories in doing these things in the past, because it's so important to learn from people that have done this before. And so I think you end up doing it the same way that you introduced feminism into those things. It just, I think the problem is like in a world of social media and TV and like the internet and like everything blasting at you really quickly, we all want like instant gratification, myself included. It's a big thing for me, but like the world isn't going to change overnight, right? Like it's going to take time. It's going to take a really long time to do these things. More than likely, it's probably not going to happen in our lifetimes. I mean, that's the unfortunate reality. But we have to start planting these seeds in order to dig up the roots. So like, I mean, again, I don't have all the answers. For me, I work in the environmental movement. I also choose to organize a lot of my time. I organize with Radical Climate Justice Organization in San Francisco. And part of it is like leading by example and just, you know, I am an animal rights person. I am vegan. I also find value in your movements and I want to be a part of them and support them. And that is enough to kind of kick off conversations. to the point where, like in the environmental movement or the environmental organization that I work with, I've already been able to write new policies that are pro-animal, right? Anti-captivity policies, working on implementing our vegan policy inside the organization, things like that. So it just starts to spread, right? Like you start planting the seeds and it spreads, and it takes a long time. It takes patience. It takes dedication. But I think, like you said, it's a total testament that hard work really pays off and it works. And I think that's really important. So we are at the end of the time, unfortunately. I'm happy to hang out and talk with all of you outside or when there aren't other talks going on, or whenever you see me, just grab me. But thank you very much for sitting. Thanks for listening.
Thank you.
Thanks for being in big conversations with me.